Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martina.
And I'm your host, Cindy.
And I'm your host, Martin. And we are so excited to be with you all today for the second of our podcast in this new format. How are you all feeling, Martina and Cindy?
Feeling good. I'm excited. I think last week was a lot of nerves. And after listening to the podcast, it felt good. And I just appreciated the conversation. So excited for another conversation today.
Same. I'm really looking forward to our topic today.
And what is our topic today, Cindy?
It is emotional sobriety.
That's a heavy concept.
It is. It is.
All right. Well, everybody, sit back, enjoy. We're really excited to bring you this episode. Today, you're going to hear Martina, Cindy, and myself have a conversation together. So we are just excited to have this conversation and have you be a part of it as always. We love that you're here with us. We want to make sure that you remember to subscribe on whatever platform you like. If you're listening to us on YouTube, please hit the like button. Please share with your family and friends so that you all can grow with us as we move forward with our new podcast format.
Hey, everybody. This is your host, Cindy Edwards. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, early this morning, Martin sent Martina and I a couple articles around emotional sobriety. And, I thought it was really interesting. It had me do a lot of self-reflection. So, with emotional sobriety, to me, my understanding is, when you are emotionally sober, there's a lot of calmness and, you have better judgment, right? Like with certain situations and emotions. And so for me, it just made me think, because some days I feel like I have it together. And then some days I'm just like, I find myself lashing out and then later regretting it. So, Martin, can you talk a little bit more about emotional sobriety?
Sure, I absolutely can. And I want to ask both you and Martina, and I'll ask Martina first. Had you heard about emotional sobriety before I mentioned that was going to be our topic today, Martina?
I hadn't really heard of it in terms of that language, emotional sobriety. I do, work with patients who are going through recovery with opioids. And so I prescribe Suboxone and work with counselors, and we do like a kind of a co-visit model. So I'm kind of familiar with some of the ideas, but I'd never heard the term. So I'm really excited to delve deeper and talk with you all about what that means for you.
Awesome. And Cindy, this is, this morning when you got that text from me, that was the first time you'd heard it too?
I mean, I had heard about it. I know that you've had previous podcasts with Hank, I think, and Dustin.
Oh,
I was
right.
able to listen to it a little bit, but I just didn't have a lot of knowledge around emotional sobriety.
Got you. Yeah, and it's a relatively new term for me too, you all. And I actually forgot that we did that with Hank and Dustin a little while ago. But yeah, it's a relatively new term for me too. I had never heard it before I entered into a recovery program. And, I think both of you know this at this point, but I've struggled with a lot of addictions in my life. And, really since I was a very young teenager, I started drinking and doing drugs, before I was 13, like 12, 13 years old. And was very heavily addicted to alcohol and drugs, throughout my teen years and into my early 20s. And then I got sober from drugs and alcohol, but I still had a lot of other addictions in my life. And, I just sort of traded off addictions moving forward, and then stopping things and starting things and stopping things. The drugs and alcohol never became a huge issue for me anymore, but so many other addictions did. And it wasn't until I was in my 50s, I can tell you all the story. I was actually, it was 2019. I was right before COVID, and it was Christmas Day. And as you both know, I'm Jewish. I don't really celebrate. My family that I'm with right now doesn't, celebrate Christmas very much. So I had booked a flight from Pittsburgh, where I was living, to Chicago, and then back to Pittsburgh again, just to get the status on American Airlines. So I had like a $300 credit, and I needed two more segments. I need one more flight, two more segments to get to the highest status on American. So I just got up early in the morning. I flew to Chicago. I had a 2-hour layover, and then I just flew right back to Pittsburgh. And I had this conversation. I actually had the conversation with Dustin, and, he was just, asking me, well, how come you didn't, say Merry Christmas, or, say anything, and I just, I didn't really have a good answer. And I just remember, talking to him and just feeling so disconnected. And you both know that, like, Dustin's I say he's my best friend, but he's my brother, my brother. You know what I mean? Like, not even my brother from another mother. This is my brother. We've been through everything together. And I mean, everything through the last 20 plus years. And I felt so disconnected and isolated from him, and from everybody. And, I had and have a very rich life, doing a lot of really amazing things, all this travel, all this stuff. And I'm sitting in Chicago airport, and I just started crying, just weeping. And I'm surrounded by people. It's Christmas Day. And here I am, this Jewish guy with a yarmulke on, crying in like one of the biggest airports in the world, in O'Hare Airport. And I consider that to be my bottom when it comes to the recovery program that I'm in, which is adult children of alcoholic and dysfunctional families. My parents were not alcoholics, but it was a very dysfunctional family. Dysfunction had been passed down generationally, and I've talked about that on other podcasts. But, it was that day that convinced me to ask Dustin, to ask Hank if he would sponsor me. That was really the first true recovery 12-step program that I've ever worked. Like I said, I quit drinking, I quit doing drugs, I would quit all my various addictions and then start them up again. But this, to me, this was the root. So it's only been, that was like 2.5 years ago. So it's only been 2.5 years. And it was as part of that process of working those 12 steps that I first learned about the concept of emotional sobriety. So I can talk more about what it means, but I thought I would just start with that experience and see what you all think about that story.
Well, first off, thank you for sharing with us, Martin, and sharing with us about, such a vulnerable and transformative moment in your life. And I'm curious to hear a little more about how that relates to emotional sobriety for you, that experience. But yeah, Cindy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's deep. I think I'm like sitting here painting a picture of you in the airport, Martin. And what made you feel disconnected with Dustin?
It was the fact that he was really pissed at me that I hadn't, said Merry Christmas to him, because it's just, I mean, I know it's important to him, and his boys, and I didn't do it. And so him and I got into an argument over that. And during that argument, I didn't really get angry. I just shut down.
Yeah.
And I just felt this intense feeling of like loneliness and disconnect from the person that I'm, pretty much, other than my wife, is probably closest to in the world.
Yeah.
The person that, like I said, we've been through everything. We've shared so much. And I'm like, how can I feel disconnected from this person? And what you come to understand is that it's a disconnect from self. It's not really a disconnect from other people. It's this intense disconnect from self. So like, if you think about a bottom in recovery, like you work with opioid addicts, Martina, right? So a bottom for them is going to be when they realize that they can't continue that life of being an opioid addict because they've lost everything, or their health they're about to die, or, they find themselves waking up from a stupor. That's what alcoholics will say. They wake up from days or weeks or months of being drunk and they're in a gutter. You know what I mean? It's like literally like that's what a bottom is.
Yeah.
Like you've lost everything. And so I hit an emotional bottom where I had pretty much everything I wanted in the world, but I felt like shit about myself.
Yeah.
And I felt so disconnected and isolated and alone. And when you asked me the question, well, what made me feel that way? It wasn't anything in the moment per se, but it was just this like unhealed, hurt inner child. It was just, it was a lot of things, but it was the epitome of what I would call emotional intoxication.
Mm.
So I wasn't in that moment. I wasn't sitting there drunk in the O'Hare terminal. I wasn't sitting there, high. I wasn't gambling. I wasn't watching porn. I wasn't overeating. I wasn't doing any of those things. Miserably, I was just miserably alone
Yeah.
and isolated. And it's reflective of my childhood.
Mm.
I used to sit and feel alone amongst my family. Even when I was a trainer in the anti-racist world, I'd be in a room full of 40 people. I felt alone in a room full of 40 people a lot of the time, and only felt connected when I was the one talking or presenting. But once I stopped talking or presenting, then I would go back to this feeling of loneliness and isolation. And that just goes back to the trauma that I experienced in my family. So it wasn't anything necessarily that was said between Dustin and I in that moment. It was just the accumulation of a lifetime of that unhealed trauma that brought me to that place of emotional intoxication.
Wow. And emotional intoxication. I have never heard of that either.
Yeah.
Earlier, one of the videos was emotional intoxication versus emotional sobriety. So I feel like you've shared key points that kind of give me an idea of emotional intoxication.
Well, I was just going to say, so if you have emotional sobriety, what are you being sober from? So you're getting sober from emotional intoxication. Now, the way that I see it, and I'll really put myself in it again, is emotional intoxication to me is when I indulge the emotions that are least constructive for me, right? That, for me, conflict. I refer myself to now, and I don't just say it as a joke, although people take it as a joke sometimes, but I refer to myself as a conflict addict, as well as being addicted to all these other things. Like my whole life, I've been in conflict from my youngest memory. My grandfather, when I was 9 years old, he was trying to train me to be a lawyer, and I would argue with him and his 60-year-old golf buddies. When I was 9, I'd argue politics with them and stuff. I mean, it's like from the youngest age, it was like arguing, conflict, defensiveness, anger. That's emotional intoxication for me. And when I lived in Seattle, I had a really bad gambling addiction. I mean, not the kind where I lost, like my home or my wife or anything, but the kind where I put myself in, probably tens of thousands of dollars I probably lost over the years, and put myself in a negative financial situation when I was making pretty good money.
Yeah.
And so I had a $500 limit on my ATM card, right? And I actually thank God for that, because Lord knows what would happen if I could have taken out more than 500. But I would go to the casino sometimes and I'd lose all 500 of that. And the way I think about it, when I look back on it now, it was like kind of out of body. Like I'd watch myself go back to the ATM machine, even though I said I'm only going to spend $100. I'd keep going back till it was gone, and I couldn't take out anymore. Mm-hmm. And then the next day, like 24 hours later, like to the minute, I'm standing by the ATM machine waiting till I can take out that next 500 and try to come back up. That was intoxication for gambling, right? So when I get to an emotional state now, like let's say that you and I, me and one of you two, like got into an argument about something, right? Like I've never been in an argument with either of the two of you ever. But let's just say some conflict came up or something came up, and instead of us resolving it the way that we normally would, I just like, you know what? I just said to myself, like, screw it. I'm not putting up with this anymore. Martina and Cindy, I'm not dealing with this anymore. Them coming on my podcast, I don't know. That joke just came to me. But, and obviously, like in my right mind, I don't feel that. But in an emotional intoxicated state, like I will be out of body watching myself like create conflict with the two of you.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to express that emotion. You shouldn't say that, but you say it anyways. That's emotional intoxication.
Wow.
If you say that thing to your partner, you say that thing to your child, you say that thing to your parent, your family member, your friend, because you've said it before and you've gotten this reaction before, but you do it anyways. That's emotional intoxication. Just like I knew I shouldn't go back to the ATM, but I did anyways.
Yeah.
I guess my question from that, I have a couple questions, is what do you feel like for you're getting from emotional intoxication?
That's such a great question, because it's the same thing that I would get from any of the things that I was addicted to or continue to be addicted to. And it's a rush. It's a distraction and it's a rush.
Yeah.
It's a high. Yeah. Even conflict, like conflict is a high for me. And it's also a distraction.
Right.
When you're in recovery, you realize that the reason why I love adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families so much is because I consider it to be sort of the root. It's like the root recovery program. All the recovery programs are extremely important, but if you don't get to the root of why you had those addictions, and for a lot of us, those addictions are just to distract us from like replaying our childhood trauma over and over again, or replaying emotional harm or dysfunction over and over again. So that's why we stay numbed out. And so to me, emotional intoxication serves the same purpose. It numbs me out. It distracts me. And there's a level of like an adrenaline rush, especially for me when my default is like an angry and a conflict based default. You know what I'm saying? And so I consider it to really serve the same function that all the different addictions I've dealt with have served for me, which is to get that momentary feeling of like a rush and a distraction. And then the same thing happens, which is regret afterwards, and I think that that regret becomes an addiction. Like if you have low self-esteem, and I've said before, like at times in my life, my self-esteem has been so low it almost didn't feel like I had any self-esteem. Forget about low self-esteem. I was fighting with no self-esteem. And when you have that, you actually look for situations. You become addicted to situations where you feel shame, you feel guilt, and you feel crappy about yourself. That's what it serves. That's what it serves, in my opinion, the way I understand it for me.
Well, and something, I don't know if this applies to you, but something that I was wondering about, because you mentioned, it's distraction from these root traumas. Even when you were saying that you took a flight in one day from Pittsburgh to Chicago and back just to get that status on American Airlines, it made me wonder if you feel like that's even a manifestation of some level of distraction or like busyness. Maybe not. I don't know the benefits of.
No, I think you're right on. No, I think there's no question that I mean, one of the reasons why I love that lifestyle so much was because it did keep me on that edge all the time, and exhausted all the time. When COVID, like, honestly, like if you think of all of this stuff in terms of addiction, like COVID was my, was my withdrawal. Because, COVID sat me down for 3 months. I didn't work for 3 months. And I had not worked for 3 months since I was like in my middle 20s. I hadn't experienced that. Yeah, towards my late 20s, I went and lived in Europe for a year. And the first 3 months, I lived somewhere that was really cheap to live. And, I was able to just like read books and walk and explore the city, where I lived. But since then, since I was like 27 years old, I had not gone 3 months, 4 months without working until COVID. And so COVID was like my withdrawal period from that. And it was hard. And like, I ended up having, I did all kinds of I did hypnotherapy. This is, COVID is when I started my recovery and working the 12 steps. And I would go to virtual meetings every day. Hank was my sponsor. So, he said, go to at least 30 meetings in 30 days. And if you can't find meetings, there were podcasts I listened to. And I was working the steps. So I really threw myself into a lot of stuff, and I did a lot of physical work. I lost a lot of weight. And so I really it was a moment for me to really kind of get sober.
Well, to me, that's a really powerful thing. I feel like in many ways, we can see COVID as a withdrawal for our society in so many ways. And you have me thinking about so many ways in which our society keeps us distracted and keeps us in emotional intoxication, whether it's like this constant news cycle and just the ways in which COVID showed us when we slow down all the things that come to the surface in our society. So that to me was really powerful. And that's just a powerful language for me of, COVID being a withdrawal for you and for so many of us.
Yeah. I mean, we're centering my story right now, but so many stories could be put in my place. And are we emotionally intoxicated in this country right now? Absolutely. Think of the emotions that are the prominent emotions in social media, conversations, about politics. I mean, these are the least sober emotions that we could have. We're absolutely conflict addicts. We're absolutely in this country collectively. We're absolutely emotionally intoxicated.
Yeah. And I feel like so many people, like for me, I'm such an empath. So, like, with everything that goes on every day, like, if I consume too much of it, like, I just like, I'm vibrating on like a really low, I just have like really low energy. And like, it's really heavy, to constantly digest all these emotions and all these stories that are happening every day. And like, it's very easy for people to start like detaching their emotions because like it's just too much for them to process, and like me on the other hand, I feel like this is also part of emotional intoxication. It's just like I'll sit and I'll just cry. I'll
Mm,
cry because of how
Mm,
heavy I feel of everything that's going on around me, you know.
mm,
mm,
So I think like emotional sobriety, in a way, well, I guess emotional intoxication would be to detach yourself, right? Because I feel like emotional
right.
sobriety is like letting yourself be present and like feeling the feelings that
Yeah.
you're experiencing, right? But like some people don't want to feel the feelings they're having, and so they start to detach.
Creating is the new way of fighting. At the Soul Focus Group, we're doing something radical, people. Instead of fighting against racism, sexism, and classism, which are all designed to keep us apart, we are bringing people back together again. Want to know how? By creating human solidarity. In doing so, we're improving productivity, increasing effectiveness, and transforming the way people communicate. Essentially, we're healing broken relationships. Let us bring our Creating Human Solidarity 2-day workshop to your business or organization. Sign up for this 2-day in-person workshop at thesoulfocusgroup.com because it's time we come together.
What do you recommend, Martin? Since I feel like you've had a lot of experience, with your recovery, what do you suggest for people who are looking to start moving
Mm,
out of emotional intoxication and into emotional sobriety? Like, what are some key points that you would suggest people to just kind of keep in mind?
mm. I mean, that's such a great question. Before I answer your question, I want to say perhaps, when you cry at the state of the world, that actually might be emotional sobriety.
mm,
You see what I'm saying? Because that actually is a pretty logical response to what's happening. I could argue that shutting down, especially if you're a very sensitive person, and most of us at Soul Focus Group are very sensitive people, and we're very sensitive children, and we're very sensitive adults. And I think that's what attracts us to this work. But I could argue if you're very sensitive and you feel very intensely, that it's actually emotionally sober for you to have a logical reaction like to cry, as opposed to shutting down. Because if you usually feel something in a situation and you shut down, that's also emotional intoxication. The people that are overly aggressive and conflict oriented, always seen as being emotionally intoxicated. And I would also say that just as much people who are passive aggressive, who shut down, who bury emotions, that's also emotional intoxication. That's another form of emotional intoxication. It's anytime you're not processing out your feelings and your emotions in a healthy way. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, and I wonder what you thought of that.
It makes perfect sense. I think when I'm in the moment and I'm crying, I'm like, wow, like I can't believe I'm literally just sitting here sobbing like this. And so for me in that moment, I thought that was kind of unhealthy of me. But now when I think about it, it was my way of, I guess, reducing the heaviness a little bit in some sense.
Mm. And Martina, doesn't crying like serve a physiological function for us too?
Well, yeah, you're putting me on the spot. I don't know, like the
I know.
chemical
Sorry.
science behind. No, that's okay. Behind it, but yes, I from personal experience, not as a physician, but as a person, I would say yes. But I don't know the medical part behind that. I'll look it up and get back to you.
Deal. We can bring it up on another show or a later segment or something. But I feel like I read something recently, even like it gets bacteria out or something like that. I don't know. So that's why I thought you may have seen something on that. But yeah, and I know emotionally, it's a cleansing. It's an emotional cleansing,
Mm-hmm.
and especially, being acculturated as a man and being told not to cry. And I don't cry very often at all. I'm starting to more as I get older. But I know when I do, it does feel cleansing afterwards, as opposed to, other emotions that I mentioned where it feels more like shameful afterwards and regretful afterwards. Like I wouldn't say I ever regret. I've never regretted when I've cried
Mm-hmm.
because it does seem to serve a purpose,
I was going to say, I really like that way of reflecting if we feel shame after do an action based off of emotion to kind of as an indicator of, is this me like being in my emotions, or is this me moving towards emotional intoxication? What that really resonated with me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. There's a lot of stuff out there on shame now. I know a lot of people listen to and read Brene Brown, who I've looked at her TED talk on shame, and recently been studying up on shame more, and we've come across a video that talks about how shame helps take away our genius as little kids, because if we get an answer wrong, we're made to feel shame. And what that video talked about is that shame makes us feel like we don't deserve love when we're a
Mm-hmm.
child. And one of the differences between guilt and shame, and this comes from recovery programs too, is guilt often is attached to an emotion that you can grow. Guilt could be a feeling where you actually sort of done something wrong or are connected to something that's wrong that you can actually repair, right? But shame is generally not a constructive or growth oriented emotion, and that it's connected, especially for small children. And then that stays with us over the course of our life. That when we feel shame, we feel undeserving of love and being loved. So if an emotional loop takes us to that shame place, it's not healthy. It's definitely emotional intoxication. And if that emotion takes us, to feelings where the feelings are such that it's actually going to help us grow, and it's, we can actually use it as a growth experience, then that's what I would consider to be emotional sobriety. Emotional sobriety is, as I understand it, is really, being able to feel emotions and it's not just, one of the things I sent you all today says it's not just like emotional sobriety is like all the good emotions, all the happy emotions.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what it means. Because sometimes you're going to feel sad. Sometimes you're going to feel angry. It's being able to have, for me, it's my understanding is you're able to have context and perspective on those feelings, and that you're not just in an emotional state where you're not, think about last week when we talked about first mind and second mind. I think of emotional sobriety as first mind and emotional intoxication as second mind. Like emotional intoxication to me is all rooted in the ego. And it's all rooted in, oh, what are people thinking about me right now? How am I coming across to people? Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so this, I'm so that. But it's all based on how our perception is from other people. Even, the experience that I told you being in the Chicago airport, O'Hare Airport in Chicago, it was me viewing myself through the lens of the people that were closest in my life. It wasn't really me having a clear vision of who I was. And that's why I felt so disconnected, because I was sitting there like not even really knowing who I was anymore. And to your point about staying so busy and trying to get that last, and thank God I did before COVID, by the way, because I still have that status. but,
Hey.
but in talking to, like, I was talking to some people that my wife works with, and I was looking at possibly like starting my own LLC and all this stuff. And they said, well, how much would you want to travel? Like, what's your vision? I said, well, I don't really want to travel that much, probably just once a week. And they're like, once a week is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me realize, like, I had gotten used to traveling 2 or 3 times a week. I flew like 120 segments that year, on just one airline. That's a lot of flying in 360 days when you think
Wow.
about it. I flew other airlines too,
Yeah.
And so that level of busyness, I mean, that was very astute to point that out, that's also, Workaholism is another addiction that a lot of us have. We get addicted to staying so busy. So emotional sobriety, as I understand it, is being in alignment. It's back to what we always talk about as self-focus group, where we're in alignment with our true self and we're in alignment with feelings, with how we feel about things. And it's also, I don't know if I want to use the terminology like making sense, but I would say bringing feelings into proportion. Emotional intoxication feels like everything's out of proportion. Like the little thing that triggers you and makes you so mad, and then you go off into whatever it is, whether that's a rage of anger or whether it's a complete silent shutdown. Because I'm calling them both emotional intoxication. It's not just the yelling, but it's also when you completely shut down too.
Mm-hmm.
If that's your answer to anger. But it's that little thing that becomes so out of proportion because it's attached to all these past, memories. That's what makes something an emotion. I know Madia's talked to me a few times, and I'm still trying to get my brain around the difference between emotions and feelings. And the way he describes it is the feelings are attached to our like authentic self, right? And emotions are based off of memories that usually come from dysfunction. So the emotion comes from whenever this thing has happened to me before, I know that my response is to get angry, or I know my response is to shut down. Or I know my response is to like cry, but not in that cleansing crying way, but like that emotionally manipulative crying way.
Mm.
You know what I'm talking about? Like that's my understanding of the difference between emotions and feelings, and that the feelings are the authentic, they're attached to our authentic nature, and they're, we should be feeling. We are feeling beings. That's what we are. It's the emotions, and the emotions being attached to old memories, and the emotions being attached to ego. That's where the problems come in. So for me, a big part of emotional sobriety is being in a feeling place and not so much in an emotional place.
I like that. I hadn't heard that distinction before between emotion and feeling. How I'm processing what you said. Tell me if this kind of aligns, as sort of feelings are in line with our first mind, and emotions are feelings that have been processed by our ego.
Exactly.
Wow.
That's exactly my understanding.
Yeah.
Because it's like it's a memory of a feeling. It's not the actual feeling anymore. Just like ego is the recreation of natural fears, but it's attached to things that like won't actually kill us.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've talked about before. So it's very similar. That's my understanding. Just to go back and, I'm looking at some of the notes I took when I talked to Madi, because it shows you that this is still an area of growth for me because I don't remember it. Because I know I'm very good at recall. That's why I'm good at what I do in terms of being a facilitator. But sometimes when I'm still haven't fully assimilated or fully integrated something into my life and into myself, I have trouble remembering it. But the way that Madi explained it to me is that feelings are energy vibrations, and that the interpreting of them becomes emotions. That's pretty close to what I said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that our mind puts thoughts on feelings, right? And that the ego brings past and future, and emotions are repetitive, right? It's like a trapped energy, like Madi talks about emotion, like it's a trapped energy. And feelings, like we work through the feelings, but the emotions are repetitive. That's why, like I was saying a minute ago, emotions, as I understand it, would be like every time somebody says this thing or this thing's happen, I get to the same emotional place. Awesome. Well, let's wrap this particular conversation together. I appreciate you all. You asked me great questions, and I really felt like you held space for me to be vulnerable. So I just want to thank you both, and I'm really digging this co-host thing. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And thank you, Martin, for being vulnerable and sharing, your experience with us.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Yeah. I echo that gratitude and your vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you all.
When it comes to racism, the truth is most people are only reporting on the problem. They're not solving the problem. At the Human Solidarity Project, we are doing something to solve the problem. Through our Sending the Right Signal workshop, we are teaching organizations and businesses how to move beyond DEI work. Next, we're teaching organizations how to heal from the damage caused by racism. And finally, we're showing organizations how to create cultural integration and truly bring people together. Sign up for these 3 virtual workshops today at soulfocusgroup.com. Your organization will never be the same.
Wow, you guys, that was really cool, Cindy and Martina. One of the things that I'm realizing about the new way we're going to do this podcast is that, I had in my mind, we'll do the segments every time. It's going to sound the same. People are going to love your segments and all this stuff. But I think what today showed is that we really need to have some flexibility. And I think, us deciding that the conversation that the 3 of us just had, us deciding that is going to be all we're going to have for today's episode, I think is the right thing to do. And it shows that we're going to have a lot of flexibility and that not every episode is going to sound exactly the same.
I agree. And I love that. I think having that flexibility is what's going to make our podcast interesting and different every week.
No, yeah, I really appreciate this, this format. Because for me, I just feel like it's really natural for us, like, right? We're just like having a conversation, and emotional sobriety is such a rich conversation that sometimes you kind of just don't really have, the time to just break into segments in that moment. You kind of just letting the conversation flow. So I do think, Martina, you're right. Like, this keeps it interesting for our listeners as well.
I agree. Keep it fresh, keep it interesting. That's really, I think that's really cool. And, so as I said before, I appreciate both of you very much. I'm excited for what each week is going to bring. And I know that our listeners will be too. So any last things you all want to say today?
Just thank you for sharing and for leading us in that discussion. I learned a lot, and I have a lot more to think about and reflect. So I just want to thank you for your wisdom and for your vulnerability.
Yeah, Martin. And thank you for coming up with this topic for us. It's when I was reading about it, it had me do a lot of self-reflection, and I'm really excited to share about it in our next episode once we have our own segments.
Yes. I love the cliffhanger. Stay tuned, everybody. Next episode, we get to hear Cindy and Martina's segments, and we'll also have a conversation with Dustin Washington, who I have to give him credit. Cindy was the person that actually suggested this topic. So I need to shout him out for suggesting it. And and so I'm really excited for next week. And so you all better tune in for sure. So we just want to thank each and every one of you, as always. We love that you're on this journey with us. We love each and every one of you. We want nothing for you but for you to find your own emotional sobriety, for you to be able to examine your own life, in your own life, how this shows up. We just thank you so much for being with us. We want you to go to soulfocusgroup.com, check out all of our offerings, everything we have going on. We are introducing new offerings right now. We're starting to do in-persons again. So we want you to definitely check this out. Bring us to your city, because what we're offering in person is really exciting. I'm out here in Seattle doing the training this week and next week. And then we're also doing trainings in LA. And we're excited. It's funny, we had the conversation about being on the road, but I do like being out on the road. Just doing it more in more moderation and in a more healthy way this time. But we are excited to be back out on the road, to be in person with you all. We're being safe. We're being careful. And we're also really enjoying the exchange of energy that we get being in person. So come and take a look at what we're doing and bring us to your town. So with that, we would say to everybody that we ask that you stay safe, you stay well, and most of all, that you all stay soul focused.